Hello, my name is Shawn Briscoe, and in this presentation I will discuss disadvantages which, in the policymaker paradigm, as we transitioned from the judicial model of debate to a legislative model of debate, these ideas of unintended consequences or disadvantages took the primary seat in terms of what the negative strategy would be in policy debate rounds. And so I want to spend a decent amount of time in today's presentation looking at disadvantages, how you tell a disadvantage to an audience, and so forth. And so the first thing that we need to talk about a little bit is what are disadvantages, or more correctly, what are disadvantages not? And then what are the disadvantages, or what is a disadvantage's primary stock issues? What are the core elements that ensure that you tell a compelling story to a judge? And then finally, what a disadvantage looks like when you actually construct it for a first negative constructive speech. So, what a disadvantage is not. And all of the examples that I'm going to put up here on the screen are things that I have heard debaters say or label as disadvantages, but they're not. Okay? For example, they do not solve the harm. That's a disadvantage. Well, no, it's not. Failure to solve the problem that you identify just means that your solution doesn't work, or it's not as effective as you hoped that it would be. That's not a disadvantage. It's not necessarily even a reason to reject the affirmative case or affirmative plan. How much does the plan cost? Asking any sort of a question really isn't an argument at all, but it's certainly not a description of a disadvantage or an unintended consequence, identifying something bad that happens if the judge votes for the affirmative team. To put it simply, everything in this world costs money. Everything costs something. I buy milk for my children. To be completely honest with you, I have no idea how much a gallon of milk costs, but I don't necessarily need to. Right? I have decided that whatever milk costs within reason, I am willing to spend money on that because I see it as something that my children need. I buy clothes for my children. I buy clothes for myself because I think clothing is important, right? Everything costs money. Just because it costs money doesn't make it bad, and just because I can't tell you how much a pair of jeans costs doesn't mean that I shouldn't buy them, right? They do not know how much plan costs. Again, not a disadvantage. Like I said, I don't know how much a gallon of milk costs. I don't necessarily even know how much a pair of jeans costs. I'm going to guess that when I buy my children a pair of jeans, those jeans are probably $10 or something like that, but I don't know for sure. That's not a reason for me to not buy them. They do not explain how they're going to pay for their plan. That's a disadvantage. Again, no, it's not. In fact, if you look at the debate topic, at the resolution, very few resolutions actually give the affirmative the ground or the ability to explain how they're going to pay for their plan. Most resolutions just say we should pass a certain type of policy, or we should do a certain type of action, right? And that actually fits with how our government operates. That being that we, most of the time, pass legislation on a particular issue, and then we have a separate fiscal budget, a separate piece of legislation that relates to how we pay for all of the operations of the government, right? We don't necessarily put into every piece of legislation how we're going to pay for that, and each debate resolution actually really prohibits you from doing that. Plan costs money, that's a disadvantage. Again, no, it doesn't. Costing money is not necessarily a bad thing. In order to turn that into a disadvantage, you have to show why spending that money is a bad thing, and we'll talk about that in detail here in a little while. Another example is reduced solvency. I put up here a $20,000 a year salary versus a $25,000 a year salary. Okay, let's say, for example, that an individual has been unemployed for several months. Any sort of reserve money they had set aside has been spent, they're living on credit, and so forth, and this person really needs a job, and they go to a job interview, and they think that that job is going to pay $25,000 a year. They go through the interview process, the application process, the interview process, and at the end of the interview, he is offered the job, or she's offered the job. But instead of $25,000, the company only offers $20,000 a year. Is that a disadvantage? No, it's not. It's not what you had hoped to receive, but it's not really a reason to reject. In fact, a rational person, if this is all the information they have, a rational person is not going to turn down that job because they need the money, right? They've exhausted all of their savings. They don't have any other money. They really need a job to pay the bills, to put food on the table, to buy clothing, and those sorts of things. And so they're going to take that job. Now, you might be sitting there saying, yeah, but maybe there's another job available. Well, until you can show that there are other job prospects for that individual, the only thing we can really take away, the only thing we can assume is that this is the only option. It's either have no job or have this job. The negative would certainly have the opportunity to say, well, I know about job X, Y, or jobs X, Y, and Z, which would all pay more than $20,000 a year, and there's a decent chance that you can get those jobs. But the negative has to present those arguments as alternatives to the proposal. So those are examples of what disadvantages are not. Disadvantages simply state, if you implement the affirmative plan, something bad will happen. Okay? You as the negative team are showing an unintended consequence of voting for the affirmative plan, of voting for the affirmative team, that if the judge passes that legislation, if the government were to implement that legislation, something bad would actually happen. So let's explore that with a sample debate, or let's explore the concept of a disadvantage with a sample debate. The scenario that we will use is that resolved, your parents should buy you a car for your 16th birthday, or let's say for your 17th birthday. Your parents should buy you a car for your 17th birthday. I'm going to play both the affirmative and the negative just to keep this simple. You think through the stories that I'm going to tell, and you decide whether or not the arguments that I make would convince you to vote for the affirmative, buy you a car, or vote for the negative, to not buy you the car, right? But keep in mind as we work through these scenarios, you do not intervene. You do not think about, well, but I know that that would lead to X, Y, and Z, or this is something that you haven't talked about, because that's not how a debate works. Everything in the debate is based upon what the affirmative actually says and what the negative actually says. So, resolved, your parents should buy you a car. The proposal that we'll put forth is pursuant to an optimal policy model, your parents will buy you a used Saturn for your next birthday. Funding and enforcement will be done through normal means, and I reserve the right to clarify my plan. Fiat and legislative intent are guaranteed. All that really means is they're going to buy you a car for your next birthday. That's my plan. So we can evaluate this proposal through the stock issues. In observation 1, we'll talk about the problem. We could say in subpoint A, you're missing debate tournaments. And missing debate tournaments has two dual impacts. The first is you're missing out on the opportunity to socialize with your friends, which is an important part of growth and development. And second, you're also missing out on the educational benefits of debate. The subpoint B in the harm story is that you're also late to school a lot because you're having to find other means of transportation which isn't as reliable. So you're missing out on school, you're missing out on that learning component, but you're also starting to run the risk of getting disciplined at school, right? Because the bus system in this city just simply isn't good enough to get you to school on time, and administrators are beginning to take action upon you. And so there's a couple of different harm stories that we talk about. Observation 2 is the cause of the problem. The subpoint A, the metro bus system simply isn't reliable and can't get me to school on time. The subpoint B is attitudinal, that your parents in the status quo have simply felt that public transportation and the school bus transportation is sufficient even though it's not actually working. And so you don't have a car for yourself right now. Therefore, we look at the plan, which I showed on the previous slide. We can then look at solvency. And we can look at this through two aspects of solvency. A, reliability. This vehicle is going to be far more reliable than the metro system, and we could maybe pull out some statistics on Saturns. We can look at the consumer report on this particular vehicle. We can also look at flexibility of how having your own transportation will aid your ability to do different things and meet the demands of your specific schedule based on extracurriculars in school and job and so forth. We can also talk about an additional advantage, or a planned consequence that stems beyond the initial harm story. We can talk about how by having your own vehicle, you actually get an advantage of employment, and you can supplement your family's income, and you get spending money for yourself. And so you have two dual benefits of employment by having your own vehicle. We can also talk about a social advantage, that once you have a vehicle, you can actually carpool with your friends, and on your way to and from school, to and from your extracurricular activities, you get to talk to your friends and gain that social benefit, right? And then also subpoint B is the freedom to move and do different things and access different opportunities within the city, whether it be a specific type of job or what. Other educational benefits, I don't know, at the zoo or the science center or whatever. Having your own vehicle gives you some additional opportunities. Number one, whoops. That number one is simply that a Saturn costs $3,500, which would normally be done through an automobile loan, right? So we're going to cross-apply that for this story. The second thing, though, is that we happen to know that your parents cannot get an approval for an automobile loan, that their financial situation is such that they're not going to be granted an auto loan, so you're not going to have the deficit spending. But I did happen to overhear that your parents had actually saved up $3,500 in long-term savings. So the car costs $3,500 and your parents have actually saved up $3,500. So even though they can't take out the automobile loan, they do actually have $3,500 in a savings account, which they're going to use to spend on that car. But here's the problem. They were going to use that $3,500 on some other things. Your birthday presents, and they were going to send you to debate camp next summer. Now, this one gets a little bit more tricky, because now you're losing out on some other benefits, whatever your birthday presents might be, but also a lot of the harm story and solvency story and advantage stories were related to you getting the most out of your participation in debate, right? And now you're going to lose debate camp. Your parents were going to use that $3,500 to send you to debate camp next summer, and now you don't get that opportunity. Again, now we have an offensive argument that illustrates an unintended consequence of voting for the proposal. You get a car, but you lose something else by voting for that proposal. Now, will you vote affirmative or negative? I don't know. The debate's going to have to play out on the case itself and on the disadvantage. But in the end, this gives you a strong position strategically to potentially win the debate round. So then let's look at the disadvantage specifically and what the essential components of it are. Again, remember that a disadvantage in a nutshell is if you implement the affirmative plan, something bad will happen in the future. But just like an affirmative case has certain core elements or certain stock issues, a disadvantage also has stock elements. And the essential pieces of a disadvantage are link, brink, and impact. If you watch debaters, you'll oftentimes hear in cross-examination after the 1 in C, you'll hear debaters ask, what's your link, what's your brink, what's your impact? All they're really asking is, the impact is what's the bad thing that happens? If I vote for the affirmative plan and cause this disadvantage, what is the bad thing that happens? That's your impact. The link is the trigger. What is it that I do that eventually causes the impact to happen? And then the brink is the notion that we're at the edge of disaster. I like to use a story of telling a story about how I've upset a student and I take them someplace like Hoover Dam or Red Rocks Canyon in Las Vegas or something like that. And while we're looking around, I've angered the student so much that they give me a shove and they push me over the edge of the cliff and I fall to my death. Well, the impact on that story is obviously death. The link is whatever it is that I did to upset my student, but I also had to put myself in a situation where I had an opportunity to get hurt. That being that I was at the edge of the cliff, right? So that my student could give me a push over the edge. Now, hopefully that'll never happen. I hope that I never upset a student to that degree, and I also hope that no student would ever do that. But I think that it is useful in helping us to understand the different pieces of a disadvantage. You have to trigger something. You have to do something that's a trigger that causes a bad thing to happen, but you also have to demonstrate that you're at the brink of disaster, that we're on the edge of this bad thing happening. Those are the essential pieces of a disadvantage. So let's analyze each of those stock issues a little bit more. From a link perspective, in a debate round, you can have generic links and you can have specific links. Generic links generally apply to the entire resolution. So whatever the debate topic that is that year, space exploration or ocean exploration or military troop withdrawals, The generic link is going to apply to just about any affirmative case that can possibly be run. And typically when you're constructing a disadvantage, you want to have generic links so that no matter what the affirmative case is, you have an offensive argument which you can run in the debate round. But you also want to have specific link evidence for a number of different cases so that no matter what the affirmative case is that you're going up against is, you can pull out a specific link evidence to apply it to that particular plan, right? So you have generic and specific links. But then there's also internal links. It's generally not so straightforward that you just go from the link to the impact, the trigger to the bad thing, particularly as disadvantages get really big. I mean, one of the common jokes in policy debate is that everything ends in global thermonuclear war, or maybe even just extinction, right? But it's really hard to show that buying someone a car leads to extinction, right? That's pretty unreasonable, really, if you think about it. In order for you to tell some sort of a story like that, there must be lots and lots and lots of internal steps. And so you connect both ends of that story, the link being the direct application to the affirmative plan, the end impact is whatever the bad thing is, and then we have internal links, just like in a link of chains, that stem from one point to the other. And you have to demonstrate enough of that story to the judge to make it a compelling story so that they go, I see where you're taking me in this debate. I understand how the argument is developed. When you have judges who sit back and go, that's ridiculous, that doesn't make any sense, probably what's happening is you've stretched too far. You haven't told enough of the internal story to have it make any sense to that judge. Okay, so if you look back at the scenarios that I gave to you, the initial link on this savings trade-off disadvantage was that the car costs $3,500, right? And so they have to spend some money. So that's your initial link. But there's also an internal link, and the internal link is that they are going to spend their long-term savings, the $3,500 that they've saved up in the savings account. That's the internal step to get to the impact down below. So number 3 on this slide is your internal link. Arguably, you could also argue that number 2, that they don't get approval for an automobile loan, is an internal link as well. But for sure, definitely the number 3 is an internal link. And if you can break any of the links, either the initial link or the internal link when you're on the affirmative, then the disadvantage is going to break. It's going to fall apart. There's also Brink analysis. We can look at a disadvantage through the lens of the Brink, being at the edge of the cliff. Again, remember, Brink is pretty simple if you think back to the video that I showed, that you are at the edge of disaster, right? The brink of the cliff. But there's also the idea of uniqueness. Uniqueness refers to the idea that the bad thing is not happening now, or that the disadvantage itself is not happening now. So Brink would say, I'm at the edge of the cliff. Uniqueness would say, I'm not already falling over the edge of the cliff. If I was already falling over the edge of the cliff, then the disadvantage would be non-unique. It's going to happen whether the judge votes for me or not, right? And so you need to show, when you run a disadvantage, that in the status quo, in the present system, we are on stable footing. We are on stable ground. So therefore, we would have uniqueness. If you can demonstrate the Brink, that we're at the brink of the cliff, or at the brink of disaster, then that implies that the disadvantage is unique because we're not already falling. I should also give a mention to the idea of a linear disadvantage. Some disadvantages do not actually require us to be at the brink, to show that, because you can also think of a brink like the straw that broke the camel's back, that it is the last thing that causes disaster. If you put anything else on there, then everything's going to crumble. Well, a linear disadvantage simply says that the bigger the plan, the more you do, the more bad thing we have happen. And so maybe in the example of spending money potentially being bad, if you could show that the budget is tight, and every dollar that you spend trades off with a dollar coming from someplace else, maybe the food budget, then you would potentially have a disadvantage that doesn't require Brink analysis, because you don't say, oh, if you buy that, then you get no food ever again. But instead, you would show that every dollar that you spend is trading off with your ability to put food on the table, right? So that would be a linear disadvantage. which can also be a compelling story for a judge, depending on what the impact of the disadvantage actually is. If you look at this particular example, the Brink analysis and uniqueness is twofold. We know that interest rates are high right now, so that's a description of what things look like right now. We know that interest rates are high. Another part of it is the Brink analysis, is that your parents' budget is tight right now, that your parents do not have any wiggle room in the budget. So we're at the brink of the bad thing happening, right? So that first sentence on bullet number 3 is actually your Brink analysis. Okay, and then impact analysis, understanding the disadvantage through the impact level. And that's simply where you're showing a bad thing happening in the status quo. That's not unlike a harm story in an affirmative case. Show what the bad thing is. And in our disadvantages, we saw a couple of them. They're the subpoints on the last parts of each disadvantage. You lose the new clothes, the holiday trip, and a weekly allowance, or in the other scenario, you lose birthday presents and a trip to debate camp. Now, I should actually point out that your trip to debate camp in and of itself isn't actually an impact, if you think about it. In fact, several of these aren't actually impacts. They're really internal links to other impacts. So what happens when you lose debate camp? Well, that actually is an internal link to a broader impact of getting the most educational benefit out of the activity, opening a pathway to scholarships in college, and then what those scholarships in college would bring about for you. So sometimes you need to think about, have I really articulated an impact in the debate, or do I need to dig even deeper? If you've listened to my presentation on argumentation, and I talked about how you develop a chain argument where you have to keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper until you reach a point where your judge understands what you're talking about, this might be an example of that, where you need to dig beyond just you lose debate camp into why debate camp matters. Okay, again, the impact analysis. You can have generic impacts, which simply say things like, again, typically the joke in debate is that everything ends in global thermonuclear war. A generic impact might just say that this will trigger a war, but it doesn't really specify who's going to go to war, why they're going to war, what that war is going to look like, and so forth. And so it might be important that you bring in an impact scenario where you give an actual explanation of who will actually be in conflict, why they will be in conflict, and how that conflict will play out. That would be the specific scenario on the impact. You might also explore the time frame of when this impact is going to happen, and then bringing it all together, then you need to understand that to have a compelling story on a disadvantage, you actually need all of those pieces, all of those stock elements. You need to have a link story with internal links that connect you to the impact. And then you also need to show us that the disadvantage is not happening right now, but we're at the edge of the cliff. And to be totally honest, each link, internal link impact needs to be unique, right? The link needs to be unique. It's not happening right now, but the internal link can't be happening right now. The impact can't be happening right now. Because if the affirmative were to show that any of those things are happening already, then the disadvantage no longer holds relevance in the debate. Because the disadvantage will happen whether we vote for the affirmative team or we don't, so we might as well vote for the affirmative because we can get something good. So responding to a disadvantage. Really, when you are on the affirmative, responding to a disadvantage is just like a negative team responding to an affirmative harms insolvency story. You go after the key weak points of the argument, which really are the Brink and uniqueness story, the link story, the internal link story, and the impact story. Identify those weak points, and then respond to them in the same way that you refute the affirmative harms insolvency story. Meaning, you show things like it's less severe, deny it completely, turn the argument, and so forth. So for example, on the Brink, beating the Brink, you can deny the Brink. We're not actually at the edge of the cliff. My student is not so absolutely mad at me that she's going to give me a shove over the edge of the cliff. She might be irritated with me, but come on, am I really at that point where she's going to give me a really large shove over the edge of the cliff? You could also deny the Brink by just saying, hey, you know, Shawn's actually afraid of heights. He's probably not going to stand right up to the edge of the cliff, so even if she's really mad, he's probably going to be 5 or 6, 7 feet back, and he's not really going to run the risk of getting shoved over the edge, right? So you can deny the brink. You could also show that it's not unique, that the disadvantage is happening already, right? Maybe we know that the place on the cliff that we were standing is starting to crumble, and so whether or not the student gives me a shove or not, the cliff is going to fall out from underneath my feet, and so that's a problem. And many times you can look at disadvantages and say, well, there are similar policies happening right now which should be causing the disadvantage, or maybe, especially think of spending disadvantages. I don't know how many teams run just generic spending disadvantages that say deficit spending bad, deficit spending will lead to all sorts of harms, it'll lead to a collapse of the economy. Well, that's pretty easy to non-unique by showing that our federal government deficit spends to the tune of trillions of dollars a year already. So what if your plan costs another $1 million or $5 million? We're already deficit spending, right? So as long as you can show that you get some sort of good, then we'd be better off. Looking at the link, you could deny the link. You could say that link story is just absolutely untrue. It doesn't apply to my case because, and provide some sort of analysis. Or you could mitigate it and say that my plan isn't necessarily big enough to push us over the brink, that my plan is not big enough to trigger the disadvantage, and so forth. That they haven't shown any sort of quantification that would explain that my case is actually big enough to trigger the disadvantage. You can look at the impact story and deny the impact. Say, no, that war will never occur. So if they run a China disadvantage, for example, that says that you implement the affirmative plan, and they have a really long internal link story that explains that China gets up with the United States and we go to war. We could say, no, the United States and China will never go to war because our economies are too interconnected, too intertwined, and both the United States and China know that if we were to go to war, we would both suffer horribly, and so therefore the United States and China simply will not go to war. So you can deny the impact. Or you can mitigate the impact. You could say that the impact of the disadvantage is less severe than the negative team makes it out to be. That sure, there might be some sort of harm or some sort of impact, but it's just not as big, right? And therefore, that would give you the opportunity to show that your affirmative benefits outweigh the disadvantage. You could also compare the time frames on the disadvantage and the affirmative case. The affirmative solves an immediate harm, whereas the disadvantage is talking about a long-term impact. Maybe we should go ahead and focus on the short-term problem and fix that right now, and we can deal with the long-term impacts later on. Which brings me to one final thought on comparing impacts. How do you do that? And there's 4 basic ways to compare impacts. And this is really kind of jumping beyond the scope of just a disadvantage, but just thinking about in a policy debate, when we use cost-benefit analysis to evaluate whether or not a plan leads to more good than bad or more bad than good, there are 4 basic ways of comparing the impacts that are present in the debate. First is to look at magnitude, the size of the impacts. How big are they? And there's 2 elements of that, the qualitative and the quantitative. The qualitative referring to the bad thing that's happening, what it looks like, what the bad thing looks like, and the quantitative, how many people does it affect, right? Both of those 2 elements go into magnitude to talk about the size of the impacts. And you can compare the impacts of the affirmative and the impacts of a disadvantage, or even a counterplan, which we'll talk about later on, or a critique, which we'll talk about later on. But you can compare the magnitudes of 2 different stories. You can also compare the likelihood of the impact stories. How likely is it that we're actually going to trigger this disadvantage versus the likelihood of solving the affirmative? You might have really big magnitude with low likelihood or on the disadvantage, but high likelihood of solvency on a smaller magnitude impact. And compare those and decide which one matters more. You could also evaluate the time frame, which I talked about on the previous slide. Which one comes first? Is one long-term? Is one immediate? And so forth. And then irreversibility. Are the impacts on some of these stories, are we able to solve them in another way? Can we fix that problem later on? Or are we stuck with it once it happens, right? Can we go back and can we address that problem in another way at a future time? Because if the impact is reversible, then maybe we shouldn't be too concerned about that particular impact story. So then writing the disadvantage. Now that you understand what goes into a disadvantage and what a disadvantage looks like conceptually, what do you need to do in the first negative constructive? Because what the 1NC's job is to lay out the foundation of the offensive arguments that the negative team is going to run, right? Just like the affirmative case had to lay out the foundations of the affirmative case, the negative needs to have the foundations of their offensive arguments. And so you need to tell a reasonable story so that the judge can conceptualize and understand what your disadvantage is talking about. You don't need to fill in every single internal link, but you need to explain enough of the story that the judge can see where you're going and why. Typically then, a disadvantage takes 3 to 5 pieces of evidence to read or to tell that story. Typically, we have one card that provides a generic link to almost any affirmative case that's topical on this resolution. Second, we provide either a Brink or a uniqueness card to show that the disadvantage isn't happening right now or that we're at the edge of disaster. And then third, we would usually have a generic impact. If it's a really big impact, or a complex story, then we might need to read some internal links, and that's where I put in the 3 to 5. The generic disadvantage would be generic link, Brink, generic impact. It might be necessary in order to make the disadvantage understandable and believable or reasonable. You might need to tell some of the internal links on that disadvantage in the 1 and C as well. Now, I would like to point out why I put generic link and generic impact in the story. I think that it's important for the 1 and C to have generic links on their disadvantages because that gives you the opportunity to read your disadvantage against almost any affirmative case. Then when they reply back and say, hey, there's no specific link to my case, you can pull out the extension evidence that says, no, your plan will also trigger this disadvantage. If you happen to have a judge who dislikes generic disadvantages, it might be necessary for you to reach into your extension files during prep time and pull out the specific link for the 1 and C. Personally, I like the idea of generic links because it makes it easier for you to kick out of the argument if you discover that it is a relatively weak argument, or they put some arguments or some responses on the argument that you didn't foresee coming. If you have a generic link, it's easier for you to kick out of the argument and say, hey, look, yeah, it doesn't apply to the affirmative case, but I still have these other offensive arguments that still apply. I also say put in a generic impact instead of a really specific impact scenario. And again, that's related to the idea of if you decide that you're not going to go for that disadvantage, if it's not a winning argument, you don't want to invest too much time telling a really specific story, particularly if the affirmative team puts turns on the disadvantage, showing that they actually don't cause the disadvantage, they prevent the disadvantage, and therefore it becomes an advantage for them. If you have a really detailed impact story, that becomes a really compelling argument for them. If you use a generic impact in the 1 and C, and they turn the disadvantage against you, it won't hold as much weight in the debate round if it's still generic. So that's why I recommend that you keep everything generic in the 1 and C. And then, like I said, traditionally then, a disadvantage is comprised of a link, a Brink, and an impact. Typically speaking, if you present those 3 ideas, you'll tell enough of a story that the judge can understand where you're going, and also that your opponents can understand where you're going, so that we actually have a good debate. Hopefully by analyzing the different concepts presented in this story, you'll understand how to present a disadvantage or an unintended consequence of voting for an affirmative proposal, and that will put you in a really strong position in the 1 and C for having some offensive arguments which you can use to your advantage to beat an affirmative case.